She ran barefoot through the rain with a diamond ring still on her finger and nothing left to believe in. The man she was going to marry was still in that hotel room, tangled in sheets with someone else, while 200 guests downstairs toasted their future. Nia Brooks had built 6 years of her life around Ethan Hargrove. 6 years. And it took 30 seconds to watch all of it turn to ash. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just ran. And when she collapsed in a dark alley in Seoul, the man who caught her wasn't a stranger at all. He was the most dangerous person she had ever tried to forget. If this is your first time watching my channel, welcome. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain started around 9. By the time Nia Brooks was standing in the marble corridor outside Suite 1408 of the Grand Seoul Hotel, her heels were already soaked from a puddle near the elevator. She hadn't noticed. She'd been too focused on the sound of her own breathing, too fast, too shallow, and on the folded card in her hand. Anonymous. No return address. 3 lines of Korean text that her phone translated with cold mechanical accuracy. Room 1408. Your fiancé. Tonight. Don't bring security. She almost threw it away. She almost laughed it off, tucked it into her clutch, went back downstairs to the crystal champagne flutes and the string quartet and the 200 people who had flown in from 3 continents to celebrate her engagement to Ethan Hargrove. She almost chose the easier story. Instead, she stood in that corridor for 4 minutes, listening to the rain streak the floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end, and then she swiped the keycard she'd lifted from Ethan's jacket pocket during the toast. The door opened. She didn't scream. That was the thing she would remember later. She didn't scream, didn't gasp, didn't make a single sound that was loud enough for the city to hear. The woman in the bed, young, dark-haired, wearing Nia's spare hotel robe, scrambled upright. Ethan turned. His face ran through expressions like a slot machine: shock, calculation, performance. He reached for words. His mouth opened. Nia set the keycard on the dresser, very carefully, and walked back out. She made it to the elevator. She made it down to the lobby. She made it through the side corridor that bypassed the ballroom doors, close enough to hear the laughter and the music and someone tapping a fork against crystal, calling for quiet, probably about to give a speech in her honor. She made it out the service exit. Then her shoes hit wet pavement and she started running. She didn't have a coat. She was wearing a floor-length gown the color of deep garnet, backless, with a structured bodice that had taken a seamstress 3 weeks to fit to her exactly. It was not a dress for running. She ran anyway. Down the side street behind the hotel, across a pedestrian bridge over the Han tributary canal, heels clicking and then sliding, and then she yanked both shoes off her feet without stopping and kept going barefoot on cold, wet Seoul concrete. 6 years. She'd met Ethan Hargrove at a conservation symposium in Chicago. She'd been 28, newly certified, barely starting to make a name for herself in restoration circles. He was 34, heir to the Hargrove Foundation, charming and well-read and dangerously attentive. He remembered things, what she'd ordered, what she'd said, the name of the Flemish master she'd written her thesis on. He made her feel seen. That was the word for it, seen. Valued for what she actually was rather than what she represented. She'd relocated to Seoul for him, given up a residency at the Rijksmuseum, sent regrets to curators who'd been trying to bring her on for 3 years. She'd told herself it was a choice, that she was choosing love and partnership and a future. She'd believed it. She stopped at the mouth of an alley near Mapo, both hands pressed against the brick, the rain plastering her hair flat to her skull. Her feet were bleeding. She could feel the sting of small cuts from the pavement, but couldn't see them in the dark. Somewhere behind her, indistinct and very far now, the city glittered. Ahead of her, the alley was narrow and unlit and smelled like wet cardboard and cigarette smoke. Her phone was in her clutch. Her clutch was in her hand. She stared at it for a long moment, rain running off her jaw, and thought through the names in her contacts. Her mother was in Atlanta. Her best friend Priya was in Mumbai. Her colleagues in Seoul were all Ethan's colleagues first. She understood that now with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass. There was no one she could call who wasn't already woven into the fabric of a life that had been entirely constructed for her. Her legs gave. She didn't fall hard. She caught herself against the wall and sank down rather than collapsed, knees hitting concrete, back against brick. The rain found her shoulders, found the bare skin of her back. She was cold. She was still holding her clutch. The diamond on her left hand caught a distant light source and fractured it into small, meaningless pieces. She heard footsteps. She heard them before she saw anything. Heavy, deliberate, more than one set. Moving through the alley from the far end, unhurried. In Seoul, in a lit district, she might not have tensed. In this dark, in this alley, at this hour, alone, she pressed herself flatter against the wall and tried to calculate whether she could run with cut feet. A flashlight clicked on. Not aimed at her directly, aimed at the ground, sweeping left and right in a practiced pattern. 2 men, black coats. Then a third figure behind them, tall, hands in pockets, not carrying a light. The flashlight found her. For a second, nobody moved. Then the tall figure in the back said something in Korean. One word, quiet. The 2 men with flashlights stopped. The tall figure walked forward alone. He crouched down in front of her. The rain was hard enough now that she had to squint to see his face. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, black hair gone wet and pushed back from his forehead. He was younger than his stillness suggested. Somewhere in his mid-30s, she would guess, with eyes that were very dark and very calm in a way that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with control. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he needs to assess quickly and accurately. "You're bleeding," he said, in English, accented but clear. "I know," she said. "Can you walk?" "I was walking fine until I stopped." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Your feet say otherwise." She looked at him. He looked at her. The rain pounded the alley around them. She was a black American woman in a garnet evening gown sitting barefoot on a wet Seoul alley floor at 9:40 at night with nowhere to go. She didn't know what he was. Not police. The coats on his men were too expensive. Not Ethan's people. She'd met all of Ethan's security. They were all ex-military American contractors with the same flat effect and the same protein bar smell. "Who are you?" she said. He stood up, offered his hand. "Someone with a car in a dry building. That's enough for tonight." She didn't take the hand immediately. She sat there in the rain looking up at him and tried to find the logic of the moment, tried to run a risk calculation on what this man was versus what she was currently sitting in. Cold concrete, open sky, no coat, no shoes, no one expecting her. She took his hand. His grip was firm and dry and completely unremarkable. He pulled her to her feet, looked down once at the condition of her feet, said something in Korean to one of his men. The man produced a field kit from somewhere inside his coat and handed it over without comment, the way a person hands over something that is regularly needed. She let the man with the kit wrap her feet. She stood with one hand braced against the alley wall and watched the tall man in the black coat stand at the alley entrance with his back to her, on the phone, speaking quietly. She thought, "I should go." She thought, "Go where?" The car was a black sedan, not ostentatious. No plates she could read from the angle she was sitting. The interior smelled of sandalwood and something faintly chemical, like gun oil, though she told herself she was imagining that. The 2 men with flashlights sat in front. She sat in back with the tall man. They drove for 20 minutes in silence. She watched Seoul slide past the rain-blurred windows. Apartment lights. Street vendors shutting down. A convenience store on a corner with 2 teenagers under the awning on their phones, entirely indifferent to the weather. Normal. All of it entirely normal. She was in the back of a stranger's car in a soaked garnet gown with wrapped feet and a diamond engagement ring that felt suddenly obscene on her hand. She pulled the ring off, put it in her clutch, closed the clasp. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that matters right now." He didn't look at her. He was watching the street ahead, arms loose at his sides. "You can leave in the morning. Tonight you sleep somewhere dry." "You don't know me." "I know you're hurt and alone and too smart to still be in that alley." He paused. "That's enough to offer a room." She turned back to the window. "Most people would ask why I was sitting in an alley in an evening gown. Most people ask questions they already know the answer to." She glanced at him. "And you know?" He turned then and looked at her directly, and she felt something, not fear exactly, not attraction exactly, something older and more complicated than either of those things. something that lived below the level of language and made the back of her neck go tight. "I know you came from the Grand Seocho," he said. "I know there's an engagement gala on the 14th floor that you're not in, and I know who the gala is for." The blood left her face. "Who are you?" she said again, and this time it wasn't a question. He turned back to the street. "Kang Tae-hyun," he said, "and you already know that name, Nia, even if you've been trying not to." She did know the name. Everyone in Seoul who moved in any circle adjacent to money, law, or power knew the name Kang Tae-hyun. He was the kind of name that got spoken carefully, not loudly, not casually, but with a precise economy of breath, like people were measuring out how much air they spent on it. He'd surfaced 8 years ago from something murky and northern and violent, built an organization that prosecutors called a syndicate and that the financial press called a conglomerate, and became the sort of man that politicians denied meeting while their aides quietly scheduled the meetings. She'd heard the name at Ethan's table once. An associate, a nervous Korean-American lawyer named Park, had let it slip in conversation and then immediately stopped talking and changed the subject and spent the rest of the evening drinking too fast. She'd filed it away the way she filed things she didn't have context for. A name, a shape in someone else's periphery. Now she was sitting in his car. The building they arrived at was in Yongsan, residential on the outside, 8 floors of glass and brushed concrete, the kind of anonymous luxury that announced nothing to the street. 2 men in the lobby stood up as she entered. Not aggressively, just stood. They tracked her without staring. She was taken to the 6th floor, a room that was too large and too clean to be anything built for guests. The furniture was permanent, the bookshelves were full, the art on the walls was real. A woman she hadn't seen before brought her a change of clothes without being asked. Dark sweatpants, a thick pullover, wool socks. No explanation offered. When the woman left, Nia stood in the center of the room for a long time. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, finally, to feel the shape of what had happened tonight. Not the anger. The anger was already there, steady and banked. She'd carry that for a while. What she let herself feel was the loneliness. The particular kind that comes from realizing you've been the only person in a situation who didn't know what was happening. Everyone else had the script. You were the only one improvising. She didn't cry. She changed her clothes. She washed her face. She sat by the window with her knees pulled up and watched the rain. Tae-hyun knocked at 2 a.m. She wasn't asleep. She said, "Come in." He was carrying 2 mugs of tea, black, no ceremony, and he sat in the chair across from her window without asking if she wanted company. He set 1 mug on the table near her elbow. She didn't touch it. "You said you know who the gala was for," she said. "Yes." "How long have you known about me?" Not a question. A statement presented as a question. He understood the difference. "Long enough," he said. "That's still not an answer." He looked at his tea, then at her. 3 years. The word landed. She said, 3 years. "I was investigating the Hargrove Foundation. You were part of the profile. You came to Seoul with him, took a consulting position at the National Museum, kept to yourself. You weren't—" He paused, and she watched him choose words with a precision that felt practiced. "You weren't part of what I was looking at." "But you looked at me." "I looked at everything connected to him. That included you. And at some point you stopped looking at me as a data point and started—" She caught herself, shifted her jaw, recalibrated. "What?" "Started watching me." Silence. "What I found," he said, "is that you were the only person in that man's entire world who wasn't performing a function. Every person around Ethan Hargrove is there because they're useful. You were the only one who seemed to actually be there." He paused. I found that difficult to understand. For a while, she looked at him steadily. "And then?" He didn't answer that. He picked up his mug, drank, set it back down. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow." "What is it?" "Evidence, documents. The kind that explain why that gala happened tonight and why your fiancé needed you specifically and why your life in Seoul was never really yours." She felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that nothing about how you ended up here was accidental." He met her eyes. Not your career placement. Not the introduction in Chicago. Not the engagement. All of it was designed. The room was very quiet. She said, "My father." His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something tightened or braced. "My father was convicted of financial fraud 8 years ago," she said. Her voice was flat and very steady, and she could feel herself holding each word like a stone. "He lost everything. His business, his reputation. He's been in a federal low-security facility in Georgia for 3 years. It destroyed my mother. It nearly destroyed me." She looked at him. "Are you telling me that's connected?" Taehyun set down his mug. "Get some sleep," he said. "Don't do that. Don't." "Nia." Quiet, direct, not unkind. "There is nothing I can tell you tonight that will help you. The documents will tell you. In the morning. And you need to be rested when you see them, because once you understand what they say, there is no unknowing it." He stood. "I'm telling you that because I know what it's like to learn something that restructures everything you thought was true. You need to be steady when that happens." She stared at him. "You'll sleep," he said. Not a command, an assessment. "I don't know if I can." "You will." He moved toward the door. "The body is smarter than the mind about these things. It knows when it needs to stop." He left. She sat by the window for another hour. Then she lay down on top of the covers, still in the clothes she'd been given, and closed her eyes. She slept. In the morning, the rain was gone and Seoul was white and cold under a flat sky. Taehyun was already in the room that functioned as a study when she came downstairs, down a half flight to a mezzanine level she hadn't seen the night before. He was at a long table covered in folders and 2 open laptops and a standing lamp that threw hard yellow light across everything. A man she hadn't seen before was with him, late 40s, slight, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades being precise. He was introduced to her as Mr. Shin. No other context was offered. She noted the way Taehyun watched Shin, attentive but with a measured distance, the way you watch a tool you trust to do its job, but wouldn't trust with the job of a different kind. "Sit," Taehyun said. She sat. What was laid out before her over the next 2 hours was not a single revelation, but a sequence of them, each one building on the last like floors of a building she'd been living in without knowing the structural engineering. She was given documents in chronological order, and Shin walked her through each one with the deadpan efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this briefing, for her specifically, she understood, because the order of it was designed to take her from the oldest point forward. 8 years ago, her father, James Brooks, a mid-size financial management firm in Atlanta, had been approached by a representative of the Hargrove Foundation's philanthropic arm with a proposal to co-manage a portfolio of charitable investment instruments. The proposal was legitimate on its face. The instruments were not. Buried inside the co-management structure were accounts channeling money from Hargrove-controlled shell entities through Brooks Financial Management and into an art acquisition network. The accounts were designed to fail traceable, meaning when investigators eventually came, the paperwork trail would point directly to Brooks FM, while the Hargrove account simply closed and vanished. James Brooks had never known what was inside the instruments he agreed to manage. The prosecution's evidence had been entirely constructed from documents produced by Hargrove Foundation attorneys. Her father had been set up. She sat with that for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the table. She was looking at a scanned copy of an internal Hargrove Foundation memo dated 6 weeks before her father's arrest, in which a financial director she'd never heard of confirmed in plain language that the exposure event was ready to be executed at any time. Exposure event. Her father's life reduced to an exposure event on a memo. "Keep going," she said. Her voice surprised her. It was steadier than she expected. Shin continued. The connection to her came 6 months after her father's conviction. A Hargrove Foundation talent identification program, ostensibly a patronage initiative for emerging conservators, had flagged her credentials, her published work on pigment analysis for Flemish Old Masters, her network access through the academic circuit, and one specific qualification that placed her on a very short list. She was one of fewer than 12 working conservators in the world certified to access a specific class of documents stored at the Hargrove Foundation's private archive. Documents classified as historical art provenance records, requiring conservation-grade handling. She stared at that. The archive, she said. The Hargrove family has operated an art acquisition and provenance documentation network for 22 years, Taehyun said from the other end of the table, where he'd been watching her work through the materials. Publicly, it's a legitimate private collection and research archive. Internally, it is the documentation infrastructure for the entire laundering operation. Every transaction, the shell entities, the charitable instruments, the wire routing is recorded in that archive under the cover of art provenance research. He paused. The archive requires physical access with conservation-grade credentials. It cannot be accessed remotely. The documentation format requires someone who understands the system to interpret it correctly. Which is me. Which is you, specifically. He leaned forward slightly. Your certification, your specialization, and your clearance with the relevant institutional partners. There are 11 other people in the world with the same combination. The Foundation tracked all 11. You were selected. She absorbed this. The room was very quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic below the window. Ethan, she said. Was the access mechanism, Taehyun said. Yes. The engagement. A legal and logistical solution. A fiancé with your credentials residing in Seoul, embedded in the Foundation's social infrastructure with legitimate access to Foundation events. He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. She was doing something she recognized in herself. An internal process of architectural demolition, taking down the load-bearing walls of a version of her life and watching what fell with them and what didn't. It was the thing she did when she lost her father, when she left Chicago, when she buried the version of herself that believed in easy choices. She was good at it by now. It still felt like being gutted. What does he want me to do? She said. Ethan, what's the move here? The Foundation is due for a significant legal vulnerability, Shin said from behind his glasses. There's an interagency investigation that has been building for 18 months. The archive contains documentation that would conclusively connect the Foundation to the laundering network. If that archive is accessed and secured before the investigation reaches critical mass, he clicked to a new document. It disappears. The Foundation restructures. The legal exposure transfers to already identified scapegoats, and I'm one of the scapegoats. You were to be the primary access mechanism and the secondary scapegoat, yes, Shin said. He said it without affect, not callously. He'd simply said the same sentence too many times to code it anymore. She looked at Taehyun. You've had this for how long? The outline of it for 3 years, he said. The documentation Shin brought me for 8 months. 8 months, she repeated. And you said nothing. What I had was not enough to move on. Not legally. Not safely. He held her gaze. Bringing you into this before the documentation was complete would have put you at risk without giving you anything to protect yourself with. Protecting me by keeping me in the dark. Protecting you by making sure that when you found out with evidence in your hands, not rumors. He didn't flinch. I know that's not satisfying. I know it doesn't feel like protection. But you're sitting here right now, safe, with documents instead of sitting in a Hargrove Foundation office being told a story they designed for you. She thought about the card slipped to her last night, room 1408. You sent the note, she said. A beat. Yes. You sent the note last night. You chose last night specifically. There was a meeting yesterday afternoon, Taehyun said, between Ethan Hargrove and 2 Foundation attorneys and a man named Weston Carr, who coordinates the Foundation's security and transitional operations. He said Carr's name with a flatness that had weight to it. They were finalizing a timeline. The archive access was scheduled for after the engagement announcement, within the week. Once you were formally engaged and living in the Foundation property, your access would have been, he searched for the word, exercised. Without my knowledge. They were going to guide you to the archive under the pretense of a conservation project. You would have handled documents you didn't know were evidence, and when the transfer was complete, you would have been the person whose fingerprints and credentials were on everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, What do you need from me? Taehyun looked at her. Something in his face changed. Not softened exactly, settled. There's a charity gala next Saturday, he said. The Hargrove Foundation's annual event. Ethan has already publicly announced you'll attend together. Given last night, he'll call, she said. He'll have a story. He always has a story. He'll call today, Taehyun confirmed, and we need you to answer. She looked down at the table, at the documents, at her father's name on a memo framing him as an exposure event. She thought about the way Ethan had looked at her last night when the door opened. The slot machine of expressions. Shock. Calculation. Performance. She understood now that all three were always happening simultaneously for him. They weren't sequential responses. They were concurrent systems, all running at once. She'd loved a machine. If I go back, she said, if I walk back into that, not back, Taehyun said. Forward. There's a difference. Will I be safe? He looked at her directly. I will not let anything happen to you. She almost said that's not an answer either. But she looked at him, at the steadiness of him, at the lack of decoration in what he'd just said. No performance in it, no flourish, just the flattest possible commitment spoken in the flattest possible register. And she thought that sometimes the most honest answers were the ones that didn't dress themselves up. Tell me what I need to do, she said. And before he could answer, her phone, sitting on the corner of the table where she'd set it when she came in, lit up. The screen read, Ethan. She looked at it. She looked at Taehyun. He said nothing. The choice was hers, and he was making no move to influence it either way, just watching her with those calm, dark eyes. And she understood that this was how it was going to work. She was the center of this, not him, not Shin, not the documents or the evidence or the 8 months of accumulated intelligence. She was the one who had to go back into that room with Ethan Hargrove and be convincing. She was the one whose hands were going to be on the mechanism when it opened. Her father's face moved through her mind. James Brooks, 61 years old, in a low-security federal facility in Georgia, 4 years into a sentence for crimes he didn't commit. She hadn't been able to visit him more than twice since coming to Seoul. She told herself it was distance, expense, scheduling. She understood now, with a clarity that hurt, that she'd also been running from the version of herself that still lived in that courtroom watching him sentenced. She picked up the phone. She answered, Naya. Ethan's voice. Low, carefully modulated, projecting a specific frequency of remorseful sincerity that she now recognized as practiced. I've been trying. I know, she said. Her voice was entirely steady. She was looking at Taehyun while she spoke, and she held his gaze, and it anchored her. We need to talk, not on the phone. Meet me tomorrow. The Foundation's reception room, noon. She let a beat pass. I need to hear everything from you, face to face. A pause on his end. Then, of course, Nia, I'm so... Noon, she said, and ended the call. She set the phone back on the table. Taehyun was looking at her. No approval, no congratulation, no softness, just that steady assessment. The Foundation building has cameras everywhere, she said. He'll want to see who I came with. He'll want to know if I've been with anyone since last night. We know. So how do I walk back in there without them knowing where I've been? That, Taehyun said. And finally there was something in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the shadow of one, something that arrived and left in the same second, is why you're meeting me tomorrow morning at 6, not noon. He reached into the center of the table and slid a single folder toward her. She opened it. Inside was a photograph, surveillance quality taken from distance. Ethan and another man she didn't recognize, standing outside a private entrance to a building she did recognize, the National Museum of Korea, after hours. The timestamp on the image was from 4 months ago. The man with Ethan was carrying a flat case of the kind used to transport archival documents. That case, she said, came out of the Foundation archive, Taehyun said, and went into a private storage facility registered under a name that does not exist. He let that sit. They're moving pieces of the archive already. They don't plan to wait until after the gala. Ethan moved up the timeline after last night. The cold moved through her again. They know I found out, she said. They know something went wrong last night. They don't know how wrong. They don't know where you are. They don't know about this room, these documents, or this conversation. He paused. They have until Saturday to believe they still control this situation. And after Saturday? Taehyun stood. He looked at her across the table covered in documents and evidence and the architectural remains of the life she'd been handed. After Saturday, he said, your father comes home. She looked at him. She looked at the folder. She thought about James Brooks in a Georgia federal facility, about her mother calling every Sunday and trying to keep her voice level, about the way her father had looked at her through prison glass on her last visit and said, don't make my mistakes, baby girl, trust what you can prove. And she thought, I'm going to prove everything. But what she didn't know yet, what none of them in that room knew, was that the man in the photograph with Ethan, the one carrying the case of archival documents out of the National Museum, was not a Foundation operative. He was something else entirely. And he had already made a phone call that morning to a number that routed through 3 countries before it reached the man it was meant for. A man who was not Ethan Hargrove. A man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of complication, and who, unlike Ethan, did not make mistakes twice. The man in the photograph had a name. Taehyun found it by 3 in the morning, not through the photograph itself, but through the case he was carrying, which had a serial registration number on the latch that linked to a procurement order filed under a dummy cultural heritage NGO based in Luxembourg. The NGO had 2 directors on paper and 1 director in practice. A man named Ronan Voss, former Interpol contractor, currently operating as what the intelligence community called a transitional asset manager, which was the kind of title that meant he moved things that needed to disappear for people who needed them to disappear cleanly. Taehyun stared at the name for a long time. Then he called a man named Baek, not his second in command, not anyone in the formal organizational structure, but a person who existed in a specific category of useful, old, quiet, connected to networks that didn't advertise. Beck picked up on the second ring despite the hour, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he already knew something was moving. Voss? Taehyun said. A pause. Where did you see that name? Connected to Hargrove, document transport, 4 months ago. Another pause. Longer. Taehyun, if Voss is inside this, it's not just Hargrove's operation anymore. I know. Voss doesn't work for foundations. He works for the people foundations work for. I know, Taehyun said again. Who has him now? That I don't have. But I can tell you he was in Seoul 10 days ago. And I can tell you he doesn't make trips for archive transport. That's not what he does. Taehyun looked out the window at the pre-dawn city. What does he do? He comes in when the original solution stops being viable and a permanent one is needed. Beck let that sentence breathe. Whatever Hargrove had planned for the woman, Voss being there means someone above Hargrove has already decided she's a liability. The call ended. Taehyun stood at the window for a long time after that. Below him, a delivery truck moved through the empty street. A single light was on in the building across the way. Someone's kitchen. Someone's ordinary insomnia. He thought about Nia asleep 2 floors up, and about the difference between a plan designed to expose a criminal network and a plan designed to survive one. Those were not always the same plan. He'd been operating on the first one. He needed to start thinking harder about the second. She was awake at 5:40. Not because she'd slept well, she hadn't, not really. More like she'd been unconscious for 4 hours and then surfaced into a state of flat, watchful alertness that her body sometimes reached when it understood something her mind was still catching up to. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands for a while. The mark from the ring was still faintly visible on her left finger. She pressed her thumb against it. When she came downstairs at 6, Taehyun was already at the table, and there was a woman with him she hadn't seen before. 40s, compact, with close-cropped hair and the kind of face that had been trained out of expressiveness. She was introduced as Yoon. No other context. Yoon looked at Nia with the neutral appraisal of someone cataloging a variable. Sit down, Taehyun said. He had coffee. He didn't look like a man who'd slept. She sat. You found something. The man in the photograph. His name is Ronan Voss. He turned the laptop to face her. A profile so sparse, the kind assembled from secondary sources. A face, mid-50s, Forgettable in the specific way that people who need to be forgettable cultivate. He is not a Hargrove employee. He is a contractor who operates several levels above the Foundation's internal structure. She looked at the photo. What does that mean? It means the people who built the system that destroyed your father are not the Hargrove family. The Hargrove family is infrastructure. Voss represents the people the infrastructure serves. She kept her eyes on the screen. And those people have significantly more resources and significantly less hesitation than Ethan Hargrove. He paused. It also means that your original plan, go back, attend the gala, deliver the evidence to prosecutors, is not sufficient. Because if Voss has been activated, by the time the gala arrives, the archive may already be gone. She looked up from the screen. You said they were moving pieces of it. Moving pieces suggests preparation. Voss arriving suggests acceleration. They may have decided not to wait for the gala. He looked at her steadily. Which means our timeline has compressed. Yoon had been quiet through this. Now she spoke, and her voice was flat and efficient. There is a window. Tonight. The Foundation building operates on a security rotation that creates a 22-minute gap between 11:40 and midnight at the private archive level. That gap has existed for months. It was built into the rotation by someone on the inside. Nia looked at her. Built in by whom? Yoon glanced at Tae-hyun. He nodded once. By me, Yoon said. I've been an administrative contractor at the Foundation for 14 months. The sentence arrived like a flat stone dropped into still water. Nia looked at Tae-hyun. He looked back at her without apology. You had someone inside, she said. Yes. For 14 months. Yes. While I was... She stopped. The geometry of it was assembling itself in her head, and she didn't like the shape it was making. While I was inside the Foundation's social infrastructure, attending their events, living in a building they own, you were never under surveillance by my people, he said. The emphasis was precise. Yoon's placement was operational. It had nothing to do with you. But you had the inside of the building mapped. You had the security rotations. You've been inside this for over a year and you never... She stopped again, breathed, reset. You never told me. You didn't know me 14 months ago. You knew me. He held her gaze. I knew your file. I didn't know you. She wanted to push on that. She could feel the argument building in her chest. The legitimate anger of it, being watched and profiled and assessed by this man while she was living her manipulated life inside his operational perimeter. It was a real anger and it deserved space. But the space was not here, and the time was not now, and she understood that. So she filed it in the same place she'd filed the ring, later. When later was a thing that existed. Tonight, she said, you want me to access the archive tonight. We need someone with the correct credentials to pull the documentation in a format that is legally admissible. I can get you in and out of the building. Yoon can manage the internal access points. But the archive itself, he paused, the archive requires you. She thought about Ethan's voice on the phone last night, the modulated remorse, the practiced frequency of it. Noon. She told him noon. Ethan will be expecting me tomorrow at noon, she said. That meeting happens as planned. Whatever happens tonight, you walk into the Foundation tomorrow at noon and you perform exactly the conversation he expects. Shock, hurt, tentative reconciliation. You need him to believe he still controls this. And if he has Voss watching that meeting, he will, Yoon said. Voss will have a read on you before you sit down. So I need to be convincing. You've been convincing for 6 years, Tae-hyun said, and there was no cruelty in it, just precision. Tonight is different. Tonight you know the script. She looked at him. And you trust me to do this? I'm sitting here with you at 6 in the morning, aren't I? Ched. The Foundation building at 11:30 at night was a different animal than the one she'd walked through 100 times in daylight. The lobby was on minimal lighting. The reception desk staffed by a single overnight security guard who was, per Yoon, reliably at the East monitoring station between 11:40 and midnight for a scheduled system check. The private elevator to the archive level required a credential card. Nia had hers. She'd never turned it in, had never been asked to, had kept it in her wallet for 8 months since a Foundation consultant had issued it to her as part of a conservation project that had never quite materialized. She'd wondered about that project at the time. It had been proposed with specificity and then quietly shelved, but the credential had stayed active. She understood now why. They went in through the building's secondary access, a maintenance corridor that Yoon had mapped in her first 3 months inside. Tae-hyun was with her. He'd left his security team outside, which she'd argued against, and he'd dismissed the argument with a single sentence. More people means more variables. He was carrying nothing visible. She understood that didn't mean he was unarmed. The corridor smelled of concrete and filtered air. Their footsteps were careful and nearly silent. Yoon was feeding them information through earpieces, small, flesh-toned, the kind that cost more than they looked. Guard position, elevator status, camera cycle. At the archive level, the air changed, cooler, drier, the kind of controlled environment that protected old materials. Nia felt it on her skin and felt, incongruously, a professional reflex. The part of her that was still and would always be a conservator, reading the atmosphere of a space and categorizing it. Climate control was running correctly. Humidity within range. Whatever was stored here was being maintained well. The archive room itself was behind a reinforced door with a keypad and credential reader. She swiped her card, entered the secondary code that had been in the original credential documentation she'd been handed 8 months ago and had memorized from habit. The door clicked open. Inside it was dense with organized materials, flat files, document boxes, a digitization station with an external hard drive bay. The materials were organized in a system she recognized, conservation standard cataloging, the kind she used professionally. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. She moved to the flat files first. Tae-hyun stood at the door, back to her, watching the corridor through a narrow gap. "You have 18 minutes," he said. Quiet. She worked fast. She'd been briefed on what she was looking for, specific cataloging series numbers that Shin had identified as corresponding to the transaction documentation. Her hands moved through the files with professional efficiency, pulling folders, scanning with the small camera Yoon had given her, replacing everything precisely. The light was low, and she was working by a pen light and her own muscle memory, and she was good at this, genuinely good. This was what she was. This was the thing that was entirely hers, regardless of what had been built around it. 15 minutes in, she found the series. The documents were inside a flat file marked with a conservation code that looked routine. She opened it. Inside was a nested set of folders, and inside those folders was the architecture of a laundering network spanning 22 years, documented in the meticulous record-keeping language of art provenance. Acquisition dates, transaction chains, authentication certifications, provenance transfers, all of it real documentation and all of it encoding, if you knew the system. The financial movements underneath. She photographed everything. Her hands were completely steady. She did not think about her father. She could not afford to think about her father right now. 12 minutes, Tae-hyun said. I know. She was on the third nested folder when she heard it, a sound from the corridor, different from the building's ambient noise, not mechanical, not HVAC, footsteps, not Yoon's pattern. Tae-hyun went very still at the door. She kept photographing. "Someone on the floor," he said, voice dropping to almost nothing. "Not the rotation." "How long?" 40 seconds. Keep going." She kept going. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was doing something she ignored. 20 seconds. She finished the third folder, started the fourth. "Nia, I need 2 more minutes." "We don't have 2 minutes. I need what's in this folder, or the chain of evidence is incomplete and the whole thing falls apart in court." She didn't look up. "Buy me 2 minutes." A silence. Then the sound of the door moving, not closing entirely but shifting, and Tae-hyun's footsteps moving away from it into the corridor. She heard him say something in Korean, conversational, the tone of a man who belongs exactly where he is. A response. Male voice, unknown. A pause. She photographed. Turned page. Photographed. The voices in the corridor continued. She couldn't track the Korean fast enough to follow it, but she could read the rhythm of it. Question, answer, question, a beat that stretched. She was on the last document in the fourth folder when she heard the change in the rhythm. A different kind of silence. Then nothing. Then Tae-hyun back at the door. "Close it up." She replaced the folder, closed the flat file, killed the pen light. The camera was in her jacket pocket. She moved to the door. What happened, she'd said. Foundation overnight consultant. He's taken care of. Taken care of? He's in a closet, unconscious, and will wake up with a headache and no memory of the last 2 minutes because the compound Yoon put in his coffee 4 hours ago has a selective amnesiac window. He looked at her. We don't kill people who don't need killing. She absorbed that. They moved back through the corridor fast, not running, but close. Did he see your face? She said. Yes. Then he won't remember me. He won't remember this corridor or this hour. He paused. He'll think he fell asleep at his desk. It happens. They were back through the maintenance corridor, back into the cold outside air, Yoon materializing from a shadow near the building's perimeter fence, with the specific manner of someone who had been very still for a long time. Clean? Yoon asked. Clean, Tae-hun said. Complication managed. They moved to the car. Nia sat in the back and looked at the camera in her hand, small, black, the size of a thick pen, and thought about what was on it. 22 years. Her father's ruined life. The mechanism of all of it, documented in someone else's careful handwriting. She closed her fingers around the camera. When the noon meeting at the foundation was a performance, and she gave it everything she had. Ethan was in the reception room when she arrived, standing by the window, jacket on, the studied casualness of a man who had positioned himself for maximum sympathetic effect. He looked at her when she came in, and his face arranged itself into remorse and vulnerability. And she watched it happen, and it was like watching a clock mechanism through a glass case, all the gears visible now. He talked for 11 minutes before she said anything. The woman had meant nothing. It had happened twice. It was over. He had been terrified of losing Nia. He had been under pressure from the foundation's restructuring. He had made a catastrophic mistake, and he needed her to understand how much, how deeply, he... Stop, she said. He stopped. She looked at him. She let her face do the work of a woman who was hurt and exhausted and fragile enough to be persuadable. She had spent the morning with Tae-hyun and Yoon working through exactly what she needed this performance to accomplish. She needed Ethan confident. She needed him to believe the gala was still viable. She needed him to not yet move the archive. I need time, she said. I can't just... She let her voice break slightly, just slightly, the precise amount. I need to know you're serious about this. I am, he said immediately. Nia, I am absolutely... Come to the gala with me, she said. Show me in public. Show me this is real. She looked at her hands. I'll be there, Saturday. I'll stand next to you and we'll tell everyone we're fine, and then we talk, really talk. He crossed to her. He put his hand over hers. His eyes were full of the precise, correct emotion. Yes, he said. Yes, of course. Thank you for... Don't thank me, she said. Not yet. She left the foundation building at 12:40. She walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop, ordered something she didn't drink, sat at a corner table, and allowed herself to be completely still for exactly 4 minutes. Then she texted Tae-hyun 3 words. He took it. The reply came back in under 30 seconds. Voss is in Seoul. She stared at the screen. He flew in this morning. He knows about last night. Not the archive, but the alley. He has your photo. She felt the cold move through her again, different this time, more specific. Not the cold of revelation, the cold of being found. He doesn't know where you've been staying. He's running your contacts. He'll move to your apartment by tonight. She thought about her apartment, her things, her work materials, irreplaceable reference books, her own research notes, a portable spectrometer that had taken her 3 years to save for. Leave it, Tae-hyun texted, as if reading the thought. All of it. Don't go back. She looked around the coffee shop. Ordinary Thursday afternoon in Seoul. 2 students at laptops. A woman with a stroller. The barista restocking the pastry case with the particular mindless efficiency of someone 3 hours from the end of a long shift. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Tae-hyun. It was a number she didn't recognize, Korean prefix. She almost didn't answer. She answered. A voice she didn't know. Male, accented with something European underneath the Korean. Unhurried in the way of someone who has never needed to hurry because things happen when he decides they happen. Ms. Brooks, the voice said. My name is not important. What is important is that you have something that belongs to a client of mine, and I'd like to discuss how we resolve that before Saturday becomes complicated for everyone." She said nothing. "I know you were in the building last night," the voice said. "I know what you took. I know where you had breakfast this morning and what you ordered." A pause. "I do not know yet where you slept, but I will. These things are a matter of patience." Another pause. "I'm calling because I think you're intelligent enough to understand that the plan you're currently executing cannot succeed. Not because the evidence isn't real. It is, and it's damning, but because the people you're working with are not equipped to protect you from what comes after you try to use it." She was breathing very carefully. 4 count in, hold, out. "What I'm offering," the voice said, "is a conversation. Neutral ground. You walk away with your father's case reviewed, your career intact, and a significant financial settlement. The documentation is returned. Everyone moves forward." She said, "And Kang Tae-hyun." A pause, fractionally longer than the others. "Mr. Kang is a separate matter," the voice said. "One that predates your involvement." She understood what that meant. "I'll think about it," she said. "You have until 9 tonight," the voice said. "After that, the offer is no longer available, and the approach becomes less." A small pause, delicate, almost polite, conversational. The call ended. She sat in the coffee shop for another 30 seconds. Then she called Tae-hyun. He picked up on the first ring. "Voss called me," she said. Silence. Then, "When?" 30 seconds ago." "What number?" She read it out. She heard him relay it to someone in the background, heard the quiet efficiency of his operation moving around him. "He offered a deal," she said. "My father's case, financial settlement. I returned the archive documents." "And me?" "He said you were a separate matter." Another silence, and in that silence she could hear something she hadn't heard from him before. Not fear, exactly. Something older. The sound of a man who has been careful for a very long time and has just confirmed that the careful time is ending. "Nia," he said. "I know," she said. "If he has your photo from the alley, he has mine. I know. This changes what Saturday needs to." "Is what?" "I know," she said, and her voice was harder now, not angry, just compressed, the way a structure compresses under load. "I know what it changes. I'm not taking his deal. I'm not returning anything, and I'm not letting you become a separate matter." She paused. "But I need you to tell me something true right now." "Ask." 3 years ago," she said, "when you were profiling me, when I was a data point in your investigation." She looked at the pastry case, at the barista, at the perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon of this perfectly ordinary coffee shop. "Was there ever a moment where you could have warned me, where you knew enough to pull me out of it, but you didn't because the operation was more useful with me inside?" The silence was long enough that she knew the answer before he gave it. "Yes," he said. One word. Flat. Not dressed up. She closed her eyes. "Once," he said, 14 months ago, "I had enough to warn you about Ethan's intention without burning the full investigation. I made a calculation." A pause. "I decided the operation needed more time. I decided you were safer not knowing." Another pause. "I was wrong. Not about the operation. About what it cost you. Those 14 months cost you something I didn't have the right to take." She opened her eyes. She looked at the ordinary Thursday afternoon outside the coffee shop window, Seoul moving past in its ordinary continuous motion. "Okay," she said. "Okay? It doesn't change tonight. It doesn't change Saturday." She stood, put money on the table. "But after this is over, we're going to have a conversation about that calculation. A real one." "Yes," he said. "We will." She walked out of the coffee shop into the cold Seoul afternoon and turned toward the direction of nowhere in particular, moving because stillness was no longer an option. The camera in her pocket, and Voss's voice still in her ear, and Saturday 4 days away, and the whole architecture of it pressing down from above like a ceiling beginning its slow, inevitable descent. And she thought, there is no version of this where I walk away clean. There is only a version where I walk away. That would have to be enough. But that was before she turned the corner onto the main street and saw, parked across from the coffee shop she'd just left, a black car she didn't recognize. and in the passenger window, just for a second, the face of the man from the photograph. Ronan Voss. Looking directly at, her feet stopped. Not a decision, a reflex, the kind that happens below the level of choice, the body reading danger before the mind finishes the sentence. She was on the corner of Mapodaiero and a side street she didn't know the name of, and Ronan Voss was in a parked car 20 meters behind her, and for exactly 3 seconds, she stood completely still on the pavement, while Seoul moved around her like water around a stone. Then she walked. Not fast. Not slow. The specific pace of a person with somewhere ordinary to be. She turned left at the next intersection, not because left meant anything, but because left meant not straight, not back, not toward the car. Her hand was in her jacket pocket, and her fingers were around the camera, and she was thinking with the cold mechanical part of her brain that had taken over from everything else. He saw me leave the coffee shop. He knows which direction I turned. He does not know if I saw him. She turned left again. Then right. Into a covered market, narrow, loud, vendors and shoppers, and the smell of fish and garlic and something frying. She moved through it without looking back. At the far exit, she turned into a side street, found a recessed doorway, pressed herself into it, and called Tai Hyun. Voss is outside the coffee shop, she said the second he picked up. Physical. In a car. He saw me leave. She heard him move, the sound of a chair, footsteps, a door. Are you mobile? Yes. I'm in the market off Mapodaiero, the covered one near the pedestrian bridge. Stay inside, don't exit onto the main road. A pause, and she heard him speaking to someone else in the background, low and fast. Yoon is 4 minutes from your position. Gray coat, carrying a shopping bag from a green store. She'll find you. Don't look for her. Just keep moving slowly through the market. He saw my face, Taehyun. I know, which means he has my face confirmed to my location in real time. I know. Keep moving. Don't stop talking to me. She kept moving, through the market, past a woman selling dried peppers, past a stall of imported goods, past a teenage boy restacking boxes with the focused indifference of someone being paid by the hour. She kept the phone to her ear and kept her voice at conversational volume. Just a woman on the phone, completely ordinary, entirely unremarkable. He has 4 days to find me before the gala, she said. He had 4 days this morning. He has less now. What does that mean? It means the timeline changed again. A beat. We need to talk tonight. All of us. There are things I need to tell you before Saturday that I was going to tell you tomorrow. Tell me now. Not on the phone. Taehyun. Not on the phone, he said again, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not urgency. He was always urgent in a controlled way. This was different. This was the sound of a man who was deciding how much weight a structure could hold before he told you it was cracking. Yoon is in the market. Gray coat. Keep walking. She kept walking. Yoon found her near the dried goods section, and the handoff was so clean that a person watching would have seen 2 women briefly occupy the same narrow aisle, and then one of them was gone, and the other was walking toward the market's north exit in a different jacket. Dark green, Yoon's, exchanged in a moment too brief to track, with the gray coat folded over her arm and the camera still in her pocket. The safe house this time was different. Smaller, in Seoul, 3rd floor of a building that smelled of old wallpaper and someone else's cooking. Taehyun was already there when she arrived, and so was Shin, and so was a man she'd never seen before. Korean, late 50s, with a prosecutor's posture and the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people for lies. Taehyun introduced him. Prosecutor Han Jae-won, Federal Anti-Corruption Division. She looked at the prosecutor, then at Taehyun. You brought in law enforcement, she said. Controlled law enforcement, Taehyun said. Han has been building a parallel case for 16 months. He is the reason the interagency investigation exists. He is also the reason it hasn't moved fast enough, because his evidence has the same problem ours does. It's complete except for the archive documentation. Han Jae-won looked at her. Miss Brooks, I understand you accessed the archive last night. Yes. And the documentation you recovered. She put the camera on the table. Han looked at it, then at her. Something moved through his expression, not relief exactly. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been waiting a long time for something small and crucial and has just watched it arrive. "We need to verify the files," he said. "Verify them," she said. "And then tell me about Saturday, because whatever you're planning isn't going to work the way you think it is. Voss is physical, and he's already running my location. If he finds this place, he won't find this place," Taehyun said. "He found me outside a coffee shop I'd been in for 11 minutes. He found you because he had your photo from the alley, and he had your face in his tracking system, and Seoul has cameras everywhere." Taehyun looked at her steadily. "He does not have this address. He does not have Yoon's face. He does not have Han's involvement." He paused. "What he has is you, mobile, in a city, and that's a problem we've managed." She sat down. She was tired in a way that had moved past the physical into something structural, something in the foundation of her. She had been running on adrenaline and cold process thinking for 36 hours, and she could feel the edges of it starting to fray. "Talk," she said. "Tell me what you were going to tell me tomorrow." Taehyun sat down across from her. Han sat to the side. Shin was at the laptop, already pulling up the camera's files. Taehyun said, "Ronan Voss has been in Seoul before." "You told me, 10 days ago." "Before that," he said, 7 years ago, 18 months ago, and once, 8 years ago, for a specific operation connected to the Hargrove Foundation's first major exposure risk." He paused. 8 years ago, Voss was brought in because a financial management firm in Atlanta had become a liability. The setup against your father, the constructed documentation, the prosecution evidence, Voss built that. Not the Hargrove attorneys, Voss. She was looking at him. She was very still. "He's done this before," she said. "Your father was not the first person to be used as a transitional liability by this network. He was one of several." Taehyun's voice was level, not gentle, just precise. Voss is the architect of the clean exit strategy. When the network decides an asset has become an exposure, Voss builds the documentation that transfers the exposure to the asset, executes the evidence plant, and exits before the investigation closes. He met her eyes. "He's very good at it. He has done it at least 6 times across 4 countries. She breathed. 4 count. Hold. "And the reason you're telling me this tonight instead of tomorrow," she said, "is because this afternoon, while you were meeting Ethan, Voss made a call." Taehyun's hands were flat on the table. "To a number inside this operation." The room changed. Not physically. The wallpaper was still old and the cooking smell was still there, and Han was still sitting at the same angle. But something happened to the air in the room, some pressure differential that she felt in her sternum. She looked at him. "Inside this operation?" "Yes." "How inside?" He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Han. Han looked at his hands. "Han Jae-won," she said. The prosecutor's face didn't move. "No," Taehyun said. Then, "Shin." She turned. Shin was at the laptop. His back was to the room. His shoulders were very still, which was the stillness of a person who knows they've been named and is deciding what to do about it. "Shin," Taehyun said again. Not loud. The way you say the name of something you've confirmed. Shin turned around. He looked at Nia first, then at Tae. Hyun. His expression was the expression of a man removing a performance. Not slowly, not dramatically, but cleanly, the way you peel a label off glass. Underneath it was something that had always been there: calculation, patience, the complete absence of the loyalty she'd read into his efficient briefings and his flat delivery. "How long?" Taehyun said. Shin said nothing. "How long?" Taehyun said again, and the second time the flatness in his voice had an edge under it. Not anger. Anger was too warm. This was colder than anger. This was the sound of a man recalibrating every interaction he'd had with another person for an extended period of time. "The document she photographed last night," Shin said. His voice was the same as it always was. Unhurried, precise, the voice of a man reading from a brief. "They're incomplete." Nia went cold. "The 4th folder," Shin said. He looked at her. "You photographed the 4th folder." What's in the fourth folder is real. It's real documentation. It will hold up in court. It's genuinely damning. He paused. But it's the surface layer, the deep archive, the transaction records that connect the network's principals above the Hargrove level, the records that would expose who Voss actually works for. That documentation was moved 6 weeks ago to a secondary location that is not in this building's archive. You told Voss we were going in last night, she said. I told Voss the timeline. His tone didn't change. I did not tell him to send someone to intercept. That was his decision. You told him, she said again, and her voice had a quality she didn't fully recognize in herself. Not loud, not cracked, completely level and completely cold. The voice of a woman who has just watched the last wall come down and is standing in the open. I gave him time to move the deep archive before you got to it, Shin said. Yes. Han Jae-won stood up. He had his hand on something inside his jacket, and his face had the focused stillness of a man doing his job. Don't, Tae-hyun said. Not to Han, to Shin. Shin looked at the hand inside Han's jacket. He calculated. He sat very still. Who has the deep archive? Tae-hyun said. Voss? Where? I don't know the location. I was given a contact protocol. I pass information. I receive... He stopped. For the first time, something crossed his face that wasn't performance. Not guilt. More than guilt. Something underneath guilt. The look of a man who made a choice far enough back that he'd stopped examining it and has now been forced to look at it again in full light. I receive instructions. Why? Nia said. Shin looked at her. Why did you do it? She said. Her voice was still level. She needed it to stay level. If it stopped being level, she didn't know what it would become. My father has been in prison for 3 years. You knew that. You sat in that room and you walked me through those documents and you watched me understand what was done to him, and you knew the whole time that the evidence we needed was already gone. Why? Shin's jaw moved. He looked at the table. My daughter, he said. They have my daughter. Silence. Han sat back down. Very slowly. She's 23, Shin said. His voice had changed, the briefing cadence was gone, and what was under it was ordinary and wrecked. She was in Busan. They found her 8 months ago, and they told me if I fed them the operation, they would release her after it was done, after the gala, after the archive was secured. He looked at Tae-hyun. I know what that means. I know what after it was done means, but He stopped. She's 23. The room was very quiet. Nia looked at Tae-hyun. His face was doing the same thing she'd seen it do in the alley. That controlled processing, reading a situation for what it was rather than what he wished it were. But underneath the control, in the set of his jaw, she could see something she hadn't seen there before. The specific exhaustion of a man who built a thing over years and is watching it develop a fault line he didn't design. Do you have a contact for Voss? Tae-hyun said to Shin. Yes. Can you reach him tonight? If I initiate contact, it will confirm to him that I've been exposed. He'll move. I know what he'll move, Tae-hyun said. Can you reach him? Shin looked at him for a long moment. Yes. Then we have one card left, Tae-hyun said. He looked at Han. Han looked back, and something passed between them. The compressed communication of two people who have been thinking about the same problem from different angles and have just arrived at the same answer through different doors. The deep archive, Han said. If Voss has it. He hasn't moved it out of Seoul yet, Tae-hyun said. If he had, he wouldn't still be here. He's here because the gala is Saturday, and he needs to be present for the final phase, which means the archive is here. You can't find a single location in a city this size in 3 days, Han said. No, Tae-hyun said, but I can find a man who knows where it is. He looked at Shin. You're going to help me. Shin looked at his hands. If I help you, they'll know. And my daughter. Your daughter is already in danger, Tae-hyun said, and his voice was not unkind, it was just true. She was in danger the moment they took her. The only question is whether she's in danger on their timeline or ours. He let that land. Help me find the archive. I will find your daughter. I have people in Busan. I will find her tonight if you give me what I need. Shin's hands were trembling now. Small tremors. The kind a person can't control. the body expressing what the face is holding back. He was a man who had been carrying a thing in silence for 8 months. The specific torture of a person who has betrayed people they respected to protect someone they loved and has had to pretend each day that neither of those things was happening. A warehouse, Shin said. His voice was barely above a breath. Incheon, near the port. He used it for a transit operation 18 months ago. He wouldn't use a new location. Voss uses infrastructure he trusts. Tae-hyun was already on the phone. But what happened next happened fast, and Nia was not part of the fastest parts of it. She understood that. She sat in the Seodaemun safe house with Han Jae-won and Shin, who was now cooperating with the focused desperation of a man who has made every wrong choice and has been handed one right one. And she watched Tae-hyun's operation move through its communications the way she imagined a controlled detonation moved, precise, sequential, each piece timed to the one before. 2 of his men went to Busan. The contact number Shin had used to reach Voss was handed to Han's technical team, who began the kind of triangulation that required warrants in normal circumstances, and were obtaining them at 10 at night because Han had a federal judge on the phone and the documentation from the archive camera to justify emergency authorization. She sat at the window of the safe house and looked at the Seodaemun street and thought about Shin's daughter. 23 years old, being held somewhere as leverage against a father who had no good options. She thought about her own father in Georgia. She thought about the way the network sustained itself. Not through violence primarily, but through exactly this. Through finding the thing a person loved and placing a hand around it and applying slow, consistent pressure until the person did what was needed. Tae-hyun came back into the room at 11:15. She looked at him. He looked back. She read his face. "They found her," she said. "Yes." He sat down. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen him look before. Not physically, something underneath that. "She's safe, detained but unharmed. My people have her. She'll be moved to a secure location tonight." Shin's head dropped into his hands. The sound he made was not a word. It was just breath, released, the sound of a pressure that had been building for 8 months, finally finding a direction to go. She looked away from him. Some things were private even in rooms with no privacy. "The warehouse in Incheon," she said. "My people are moving on it now." Tae-hyun looked at Han. "Your team needs to be in position before they go in. The archive needs to be seized under legal warrant or it's inadmissible." "They'll be there within the hour," Han said. "If Voss finds out before they arrive—" "He won't," Han said, and for the first time his voice had something in it that wasn't exhaustion. "I've been building toward this for 16 months. I know how to move without a leak." Tae-hyun looked at him. A long look. The look of a man who has just discovered one person inside his operation was compromised and is measuring whether the information makes him trust other people less or more carefully. "All right," Tae-hyun said. He looked at Nia. She looked back at him, and she understood that they were both arriving at the same threshold, the point at which planning ends and the thing itself begins. The gala was Saturday. The archive seizure was tonight. Voss was somewhere in Seoul, not yet knowing that the warehouse in Incheon was compromised, not yet knowing that his leverage over Shin was gone. But Voss was smart. He had managed exposure events in 4 countries. He had built the case that sent her father to prison. He was not going to be slow about recognizing when a situation had shifted. "He'll know by morning," she said. "When his people in Busan don't check in, when the warehouse goes silent." She looked at Tae-hyun. "He'll know by morning that everything has changed." "Yes," Tae-hyun said, "and then he won't wait for Saturday." "No." "So Saturday has to happen tomorrow." Tae-hyun was quiet for a moment. Then, "Friday night, the museum has its pre-gala set up from 6. The foundation staff will be on site. Ethan will be there. If we move the event—" "We don't move the event," Han said. "Moving the event destroys the legal framework I've built. The warrants are calibrated to Saturday's timeline. The prosecutors across 3 jurisdictions are coordinated for Saturday. If we move it to Friday, we lose half the legal architecture." "Then we survive until Saturday," Tae-hyun said. "With Voss knowing his operation is burning," Nia said. "With Voss knowing his operation is burning," he confirmed. She looked at him, at Han, at Shin, who had raised his head from his hands and was sitting with the hollow steadiness of a man who has nothing left to lose but the one thing that mattered and has been told that thing is safe. "What do you need me to do between now and Saturday?" she said. Taehyun looked at her for a long moment. She recognized the look. It was the look from the alley, the first night when he'd crouched down in the rain and assessed her, reading her for what she was, not what he needed her to be. "Nothing," he said. "Stay inside, stay off your phone. Let us work." "That's not an answer I'm going to give you." "Naya, I spent 6 years doing nothing," she said. "I spent 6 years being managed and positioned and kept in the dark, and I ended up barefoot in an alley on a Tuesday night. You don't get to tell me to do nothing." He held her gaze. His jaw moved slightly. "Then stay close," he said, "and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. No improvisation." She thought about the archive room, the pen light, the 4 minutes she'd bought him while he stalled the security consultant in the corridor. The part of that night that had been entirely hers, her hands, her training, her speed. "Within reason," she said. His mouth moved at the corner. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one, arriving and leaving in the same breath, the way it always did. Then Han's phone went off. He looked at the screen. His face changed, not dramatically, just a tightening, the expression of a man receiving a number he was hoping for and fearing in equal measure. "The Incheon team is in position," he said. He looked at Taehyun. "They found the warehouse." Taehyun stood. "And?" he said. Han looked up from the phone. The tightening in his face had become something else, the specific expression of a man holding bad news while still processing the shape of it. "The archive is there," Han said. "All of it. Intact." He paused. "But Voss is not at the warehouse." Another pause. "His car was tracked 40 minutes ago to the Yongsan district." Nia went cold. Taehyun turned to her. She watched the same calculation move through his eyes that she was running in her own head. Yongsan, his building, the safe house they'd left hours ago, the address that Shin had said Voss didn't have. "Shin," Taehyun said, very quietly. Shin looked up. His face was already collapsing. "The Yongsan address," Taehyun said. "Did you give it to him?" Shin's mouth opened. What came out was barely a sound. "Before tonight," Shin said. 2 days ago. Before I knew about... Before your people found her, I didn't know you were going to... I gave him the address as a contingency. I didn't know... Who's at Yongsan right now?" Nia said. Taehyun was already moving, already on the phone, already speaking fast, already across the room and at the door, and she was on her feet following him before she'd made the conscious decision to move, because there was only one person who had been at the Yongsan building tonight, one person who had stayed behind while everyone else came here. One person whose face Nia could see in her mind with complete clarity, gray coat, close-cropped hair, the neutral appraisal of someone cataloging a variable. The phone rang twice before it went to voicemail. Yoon's voicemail. Taehyun looked at Nia, and she understood, with the totality of a person who has been running on cold process thinking for 36 hours and has just hit the one calculation she cannot manage without her hand shaking, that Yoon was inside a building that Voss now knew the address of, alone. And that the phone had rung twice and Taehyun was already running, not metaphorically, physically, down the stairwell of the Seoul building, 3 flights, his hand on the rail taking corners fast, Nia behind him matching his pace because there was no version of this where she stayed in the room. She could hear Han behind her, his dress shoes hitting the concrete steps with the flat slap of a man whose body was not built for this speed, but whose mind had already committed to it. Shin stayed upstairs. Nobody told him to. He just understood that he had already done everything useful he was capable of doing tonight, and that the rest of it was not his to carry. The car was on the street. Taehyun's driver had it running before they hit the ground floor. She didn't know how, some signal she hadn't seen, the operation communicating in a frequency she couldn't hear. She got in. Taehyun got in. Han got in. "Yongsan," Taehyun said, and the car moved. He was on the phone through the entire drive, cycling through contacts with the efficient brutality of a man triaging, who was closest to the building, who was armed, who could be there in under 4 minutes. She heard fragments. Positions confirmed. Entry routes. One voice on the other end of a call that told him something that made his jaw tighten in a specific way, and then he ended that call and started another without comment. She looked out the window at Seoul moving past in the dark. Yoon had been in that building alone. Yoon, who had spent 14 months inside the foundation building reading security rotations and memorizing maintenance corridors and building the infrastructure of an operation she'd believed in. Yoon, who had handed over her gray coat in a market aisle without hesitation or explanation. Yoon, whose face had never given anything away and whose competence had been so complete that Nia had stopped registering her as a person who could be in danger. "Is she alive?" Nia said. Taehyun looked at her. "Tell me what you know." "Her GPS signal went dark 45 minutes ago," he said. "That's either her device being taken or her killing the signal herself as a protocol." He paused. "She knows the protocol. She would have killed the signal before letting it be taken." "So she knew they were coming. She may have had warning, enough to go dark." He looked back at the road ahead. "Enough is not the same as enough." She sat with that. The Yongsan building came into view from 3 blocks out. She recognized it, the anonymous luxury of its facade, the brushed concrete and glass. Dark at this hour. Nothing visible from outside that suggested anything wrong. The car stopped half a block away. Taehyun turned to her. His face was close and his voice was very quiet and completely direct. "You stay in the car." "No." "Nia, I'm not a liability in there," she said. "I know the layout of the 6th floor. I know where the rooms are. Your people don't." "My people have been in that building." "Not the way I have." She looked at him. "And you know I'm right." His jaw moved. He looked at Han, who was already putting on a vest that had appeared from somewhere in the back of the car. Han looked back at Taehyun with the expression of a man who had stopped having opinions about other people's decisions. "You stay behind me," Taehyun said to her, "at every point. You move when I move and you stop when I stop, and if I tell you to get down, you get down before the sentence ends. Understood?" "Understood." He handed her something. Small, flat, the size of a deck of cards. She looked at it. "Panic transmitter," he said. "Button on the side. If we get separated and you hit that, 3 of my people will be within 30 seconds of your position." He looked at her steadily. "Don't get separated." She put it in her jacket pocket next to the camera that was still there from last night. 2 small objects. The thing that could burn an empire and the thing that could call for help. She thought, briefly and without sentimentality, that this was the most concentrated her life had ever felt. They moved. Uptown. The building's lobby was empty and the overnight guard's desk was unoccupied, which was wrong. Wrong enough that Taehyun stopped at the entrance and signaled the 2 men who had arrived 90 seconds ahead of them, and they communicated in the wordless efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of wrong. The guard was in the security room. She found out later, not during she was focused on the stairwell, on the 6 flights between her and the floor she knew, on the sound of her own breathing, which she was managing with deliberate 4-count discipline, because panic was a physiological event and she could interrupt it if she worked the breath, and she was working the breath. 3rd floor, 4th. At the 5th floor landing, Taehyun stopped, held up a fist. They all stopped. She listened. Voices above them, 6th floor. She couldn't make out language, too muffled, too much concrete between, but she could make out tone, and the tone was the tone of a controlled situation. Someone in charge, others responding. Taehyun looked at his men. Something passed between them. One of them broke off down the 5th floor corridor. Toward the maintenance access, she realized, the same infrastructure Yoon had mapped, the passages that ran parallel to the main structure. They continued up. The 6th floor corridor was lit at minimum, the same overnight lighting she'd seen before, amber and low. 3 doors. The room she'd slept in was at the far end. The study-level room was off the half-flight. The middle door was the one that was open. Light through the gap. Not overhead. A portable lamp, the kind people brought when they wanted to control what was visible. Taehyun moved to the wall beside the door. One of his men took the opposite wall. Han was behind her, and she could hear his breathing, controlled, experienced, a man who had been in rooms like this before, even if not in the same capacity. She looked through the gap. The room was the study mezzanine. The long table with its folders and laptops, both laptops open. Two men she didn't recognize standing near the windows, positioned like people who had been placed there rather than drifted there. And at the center of the table, sitting down, hands flat on the surface in front of her, was Yoon. Yoon was alive. She was cut above her left eyebrow, a thin line of dark blood tracking down to her cheekbone. And her posture had the particular stillness of someone who is conserving everything, not moving unless moving was necessary, reading every variable in the room and waiting for the one that changed. Standing across the table from her was Ronan Voss. She'd only seen him for a second through a car window, but she knew him. The forgettable mid-50s face, the quality of unhurriedness, the way he occupied space as if he'd arrived there slightly before everyone else and was simply waiting for them to catch up. He was talking to Yoon. She couldn't hear well enough to follow it, but she could see Yoon's face, and Yoon's face was doing the thing her face always did, giving nothing, absolutely nothing, the neutral catalog of a person who had decided some time ago to be unreadable. Taehyun touched her arm. She looked at him. He held up two fingers, pointed right, then held up one finger, pointed at himself going left. She understood. Two men at the windows. He was taking the entry. His man was going through the maintenance access to come in from the interior wall. She was not in the plan. She was pressed against the corridor wall, and she understood that clearly. Then Voss said something to Yoon, and even through the door she caught the last word. Brooks. And she watched Yoon's face for the first time give something. Not fear, anger. The flash of it, quickly controlled, but there. They were asking about her. She looked at Taehyun. He was watching the room through the gap, timing something. His body had the coiled quality of a spring that has been wound to its last increment. The maintenance panel in the interior wall opened, silent. His man came through low. Taehyun went through the door. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not coherent in the way that planned things are coherent. It was the particular chaos of a room where multiple people have been waiting for a trigger and all respond to the same trigger in the same instant. One of the window men moved toward a weapon. Taehyun was already on the nearer one, fast, controlled, the disciplined brutality of someone who had trained violence into something functional rather than emotional. The second window man turned toward Han, who was through the door now, and moving with the compressed efficiency of someone who had decided the law could manage paperwork later. Voss didn't move. He stood at the table and watched the room resolve itself around him with the expression of a man observing a weather event. Patient, calculating. He put his hands up when Taehyun's man came through the interior wall with the weapon already out. He put them up smoothly, no drama, the gesture of someone who had prepared for this contingency and found it within the acceptable range. Yoon stood up. She put her hand to the cut above her eye, looked at the blood on her fingers, and set her face back to neutral. "You're late," she said to Taehyun. "You went dark." "I went dark because he had a signal scanner." She looked at Voss with the flat assessment she used on everything. "He's been running one since he entered the building. Any active transmission would have flagged." Taehyun looked at Voss. Voss looked back. "Mr. Kang," Voss said. His voice was what she'd heard on the phone, unhurried, the European accent sitting underneath the Korean like a current under still water. "I'd like to be clear that nothing here tonight changes the fundamental situation." "The fundamental situation," Taehyun said. "The archive in Incheon is gone," Voss said. "Your people found a warehouse. The warehouse had materials. What it did not have was the primary documentation, the transaction records connecting the network's principals." He looked at Taehyun with an expression of complete reasonableness. "Those records are in a location that will be destroyed within 6 hours if I don't make a specific check-in call. Automated. Keyed to my biometrics. You cannot fake it, and you cannot stop it," Han Jae-won said very quietly. "You're lying." "Possibly," Voss said. He looked at Han with the same reasonable expression. "Are you willing to find out?" The room was quiet. Nia stepped through the door. Taehyun's head turned. His eyes said several things in sequence, none of them words. She looked at him steadily and then looked at Voss. Voss looked at her. For the first time, something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just a recalibration, the way a person adjusts an estimate when a variable presents itself. He looked at her the way she'd looked at the documents in the archive, reading, assessing, filing. "Miss Brooks," he said. "You called me yesterday?" she said. "I did." You offered me a deal. I did. He tilted his head slightly. The offer has technically expired. I know. She looked at him. I want to talk about my father. Taehyun said, Nia. James Brooks, she said, keeping her eyes on Voss. 61 years old, Atlanta. 3 years into a federal sentence for financial fraud. You built the case against him. Voss said nothing. I have documentation that proves it, she said. The memo authorizing the exposure event. The chain of constructed evidence. I have it photographed, and I have it transmitted to 3 separate secure locations that are not connected to anyone in this room and are not connected to the Hargrove Foundation. She paused. You know I went into the archive. You know what I took. I know what you think you took, Voss said. 4th folder, transaction documentation. 18 shell entities, 12 charitable instruments, 22 years of financial movement through art acquisition. She watched his face. And the memo, the one with your instruction code on it, the one that authorized my father's exposure. She paused. I know your code because it appears in 2 other documents in that archive connected to 2 other exposure events in other countries. One in the Netherlands, one in Canada. She paused again. I've had a federal prosecutor looking at those documents for the last 4 hours. Voss was still looking at her. The reasonable expression had not changed, but something behind it had, something very small and very deep, the kind of shift that happens in a person when they realize a calculation they made some time ago was based on incomplete information. You're bluffing, he said. I'm a conservator, she said. I don't bluff. I document. Silence. Han said, Mr. Voss, I have emergency warrants signed by a federal judge covering the Hargrove Foundation, its associated entities, and persons connected to its operations. Those warrants were issued 4 hours ago based on documentation recovered from a foundation archive by a credentialed professional acting under, I know what the warrants say, Voss said. Then you know that your biometric dead man switch is not going to save the documentation, Han said, because what Ms. Brooks photographed is already in the legal record. Destroying the originals removes physical evidence. It does not remove what's already been submitted. Voss looked at Nia. She looked back. Your father's case, he said. Yes. You understand that reopening his case requires more than documentation from a foundation archive. It requires prosecutorial agreement, judicial review. Prosecutor Han has already filed a parallel motion, she said, 4 hours ago, based on the same documentation. She was lying about the 4 hours. Han had filed within the last 90 minutes. But she said it the way Taehyun said things he needed to be true. Flat, with no decoration, with the authority of a person who does not need the statement to be questioned. Voss studied her. You've changed, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, the way he made all of them. When I called you yesterday, you were running. Yesterday, I didn't know everything, she said. Now I do. He turned his head toward Taehyun. And you understand that whatever happens tonight, the people above the Hargrove level are not going to be reached by a foundation prosecution. Your clients are the next problem, Taehyun said. Tonight, you're this one. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table the way Yoon had placed hers, the gesture of a person conceding a specific space without conceding the larger war. His face went back to reasonable, went back to patient, went back to the forgettable quality that was his most cultivated tool. I want terms, he said. Cooperation in exchange for the dead man switch location. Full documentation, yes, but terms. Han looked at Taehyun. Taehyun looked at Nia. She thought about her father. She thought about the exposure event memo. She thought about Voss in 4 countries, building cases against people who hadn't known they were inside them. Terms, she said, after Saturday, after the gala, after every piece of what you helped build is public and on record and cannot be buried. She looked at him. Not before. Voss looked at her for a long time. Saturday is going to be complicated, he said. I know, she said. My clients will not simply accept, I know, she said again. There will be people at that gala who are not Hargrove employees. People who do not care about legal exposure because they are beyond it. People who will... He stopped. For the first time, a different quality moved through his voice. Not fear from Voss. She didn't think Voss did fear in the way ordinary people did. But something adjacent to it. Something that sounded like a man looking at a set of events and seeing an outcome he did not engineer and cannot control. People who will not allow public exposure. Armed, Tae-hyun said. Voss looked at him. Yes. How many? I don't have a specific number. I was told the gala would be secured at a level consistent with eliminating exposure risks. He paused. All of them. Everyone connected to the investigation. That was the language. The room absorbed that. Yoon had gone still in the particular way she went still when she was converting information into operational calculation. Han's face had done the thing it did when it was holding something large with controlled hands. Tae-hyun was looking at the floor, not unfocused, processing the way he processed, by going inward and very quiet. She looked at the camera in her jacket pocket. 22 years of documentation. Her father's name on a memo. The archive in Incheon being seized right now by Han's team, the originals going into evidence, the chain of custody beginning its long legal journey. Saturday was 36 hours away. The gala was at the National Museum of Korea, and it had 200 invited guests and a press pool and live cameras from 3 networks, and a room full of people who did not know that the event they were attending was being used as the terminal point of a criminal operation. She thought about walking back into that room next to Ethan Hargrove. She thought about her father's voice through prison glass. Trust what you can prove. She had what she could prove. She had more than she'd had 48 hours ago. She had a federal prosecutor with warrants and a parallel motion and a case that was already in the record. She had a compromised operation that was no longer compromised. She had documentation transmitted to 3 secure locations. What she did not have was a way to walk into a museum on Saturday with armed mercenaries inside it and walk back out again. She looked at Tae-hyun. He was already looking at her. She said, "Tell me you have a plan." He said, "I have the beginning of one." "How much of a beginning?" "Enough to get us to Saturday." He paused. Saturday itself. Saturday itself we improvise. "Within reason," he said. She almost laughed. It was almost funny. The shadow of it moved through her face, and she let it, because in 36 hours she was going to walk into a room full of people who wanted her gone, and she needed to take every small moment of almost funny she could find before then. "Within reason," she agreed. Voss was watching them from the table. "You're going to get people killed," he said. "Not a warning, an assessment." "Possibly," Tae-hyun said, and looked at him the way Voss had looked at the room during the entry, with the patience of a person who has arrived slightly before everyone else and is simply waiting for them to catch up. "Are you going to help us or not?" Voss looked at Nia. She looked back and did not look away, and did not give him anything. He looked at his hands, at the table, at the room full of people who had, collectively, just dismantled the most reliable piece of his operational infrastructure in a single night. "Saturday," he said. "What do you need?" Tae-hyun pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, and the way he sat, unhurried, straight, completely present, made him look for the first time not like a man managing a crisis, but like a man who was exactly where he had always been heading, running a calculation that started years ago in a profile of a woman he didn't know yet, in a file he'd never intended to care about. "Start," he said, "with how many men your clients are sending into that museum." And Voss, who had managed exposure events in 4 countries and built cases against 6 innocent people and moved through the world for 20 years as the man behind the architecture of other people's ruin, opened his mouth and began. Voss talked for 2 hours. He talked with the precise, unhurried diction of a man who had decided that cooperation was the most intelligent available option and had committed to it fully, without performance, the way he did everything. He gave them numbers. 8 men, contracted through a private security firm registered in Malta, carrying tactical credentials that would pass standard event security screening. He gave them entry points. 3 of the museum's service entrances had been compromised via a catering company the foundation had used for 7 years. He gave them timing. The men would be in position by 90 minutes into the gala, when the formal program moved from cocktails to the main hall and the crowd consolidated. He gave them a name. Not the Hargrove family. Above them. A principal whose identity appeared nowhere in the Foundation's documentation because the documentation had been constructed specifically to contain exposure at the Hargrove level. A man who had used the Foundation as one of 11 similar infrastructures across 3 continents for 2 decades. Whose name, spoken into Han Jae-won's recording device at 2:30 in the morning, constituted the single most significant piece of testimony in a federal anti-corruption case that had been building for 16 months. Han sat very still through the name. Then he picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 40 seconds and was conducted in the clipped, drained language of a man delivering information he had spent years working toward and does not yet know how to feel about having. She sat across from Voss and watched him give it all away and thought about what it cost a person to build 20 years of careful, invisible architecture and then sit at a table and dismantle it in 2 hours. She didn't feel sympathy. She wasn't sure she felt anything toward him that had a clean name. He was a man who had destroyed her father's life as a line item in an operational plan, and he was also a man who was now the reason her father's life could be rebuilt. Those 2 facts existed in the same space, and she let them. At 4 in the morning, Tae-hyun stood up. "Get some sleep," he said. To her specifically, but the room took it as a general instruction and began to move. She didn't sleep. She lay in the room they gave her in the Seoul building and looked at the ceiling and ran through Saturday until the shape of it became something she could hold without her hand shaking. Then she ran through it again. Then the sky outside the window went from black to the particular dark blue that comes before actual light. And she got up, washed her face, and went downstairs. Tae-hyun was already there. Of course he was. Saturday arrived the way the worst days always do. Ordinary at first, the city indifferent to what was about to happen inside it. She woke at 6 to a Seoul that was running its normal Saturday morning, street vendors and delivery cycles, and someone practicing the same piano phrase repeatedly in an apartment above the safe house, over and over, the same 8 bars working through the difficult part. She dressed in what Yoon had brought her, not the garnet gown that was gone, left in an alley or a hotel, or the wreckage of the life she'd been handed. This was different, dark, structured, the kind of thing that moved with her. She put on minimal makeup with the focused precision of someone preparing for a specific kind of performance. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. She looked like herself. That was enough. Tae-hyun came to her door at 7. He was dressed. Dark suit, no tie. The kind of clothing that was formal enough for a gala and would not impede him if formal became the wrong requirement. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the alley, that reading, that assessment, but underneath it now something that had been accumulating across the days between something she didn't have a name for yet and wasn't going to name tonight. "You don't have to go in first," he said. "Yes, I do. Han's team can create an entry event before... If I'm not standing next to Ethan when this starts, he'll know something is wrong before it starts," she said. "And if he knows, he'll move, like he'll try to run and he'll take everything he can grab on the way out." She looked at Tae-hyun. "I have to be there. I have to be believable until I don't have to be anymore." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "There will be a point where I can't be next to you." "I know. When the mercenaries move, my people will engage them. That creates chaos in the main hall. You need to be at the broadcast station before that happens. The live feed, I know the plan. If anything goes wrong before you reach the broadcast station..." She put her hand on his arm. Brief, firm, the gesture of a person stopping a sentence that doesn't need finishing. He went quiet. "I know the plan," she said again, softer. "Let's go." Sit. The National Museum of Korea on a Saturday gala night was the kind of beautiful that felt specifically designed to make you forget the world had uglier sides. The main hall was lit with the amber warmth of 100 carefully placed fixtures, the kind of light that made everyone look a little better than they were, a little softer, a little more like the version of themselves they'd been hoping to present. 200 people in formal wear moving through it with drinks and careful conversation. A string quartet. Waitstaff in white moving with professional invisibility. She arrived at 8, on Ethan's arm. He had called her that afternoon. She'd answered. She'd been warm enough. She'd given him the performance of a woman who was hurt but present, choosing to try, choosing him. He'd been attentive and careful and had touched the small of her back when they entered the museum, and she'd let him. and had looked up at him once with an expression she had built from memory. The expression of a woman who still believed in something. She did not believe in anything he represented, but she believed in the camera in her jacket pocket, transferred that morning to a secure drive that Han's team had already submitted into the legal record. She believed in the warrants that were live and waiting. She believed in the 17 minutes between 8 o'clock and the formal program that she needed to use correctly. Ethan introduced her to people. She smiled. She said the right things. Her body was doing the work of the performance while her mind was tracking the room. The service corridor entrance on the east wall, the broadcast station at the north end where a 3-network live feed was being managed by a technical crew that had no idea what was going to come through their cameras tonight, the positions of Han's plainclothes officers distributed through the crowd like seeds in soil. She didn't look for Tae-hyun. She knew he was there, somewhere in the room, somewhere nearby, because he had told her he would be, and he was a man who said what was true rather than what was comforting. She didn't look because looking would have given something away, and she was not giving anything away. Not yet. At 8:20, Ethan drew her toward the center of the room. She recognized the move. It was a gathering move, the kind of body language that precedes a public moment. He was preparing to make a speech, the reconciliation announcement, the tightening of the political grip, the performance that would consolidate everything for the foundation's interests, and close the window she needed to be open. She had 4 minutes. She looked at him. She put her hand on his chest, the gesture of a woman who wants a moment, private, before the public thing. He looked down at her, smiled. "In a minute," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "I need to tell you something first. Privately." He read her face. He saw the woman he thought he knew. Of course. He steered her toward the edge of the room, near the east corridor entrance, away from the crowd. They stood at the margin of the gala, close enough to the corridor that she could see the service door. She was measuring distance in her head. Broadcast station, north end, 140 feet through the crowd. "What is it?" Ethan said. She looked at him. She took his measure one final time. The engineered charm of him, the slot machine expressions, the architecture of manipulation that had been built so carefully around something that had never been real. She thought about the 6 years. She thought about Chicago and the symposium and the way he'd remembered what she'd ordered and the name of the Flemish master. All of it designed, all of it a mechanism. She thought about what it cost to love a machine without knowing it. "The evidence has already been delivered," she said. His face went through the slot machine. This time the sequence was different. Shock was real. Calculation was real, but performance didn't come. For the first time she saw what was underneath when the machine failed to complete its cycle. Something cold. Something that had always been there, that the charm had been built specifically to cover. "What?" he said. "The archive documentation, the transaction records, the shell entities, the charitable instruments, the 22 years of financial movement." She held his eyes. "Your attorneys have already been served. The foundation's accounts are being frozen right now. The warrants are live." He stared at her. "The memo," she said. "The one authorizing my father's exposure event. It's in the record, with your family's authorization code on it." She paused. "Your name is on that memo, Ethan. Not your father's. Yours." His hand moved. Not toward her. A reflexive movement toward his jacket, the instinct of a man reaching for a phone or a panic button or whatever his equivalent of the transmitter in her pocket was. She stepped back. The east corridor door opened. Not her doing. Han's timing, executed to the second. 2 plainclothes officers, credentials out, moving into the space with the quiet authority of people who have warrants and do not need to raise their voices. Ethan looked at them. Then he looked at her. "You," he started. "My father comes home," she said. "That's all this ever was." She turned and walked north through the gala, and the crowd was still doing its Saturday evening thing. Drinks and conversation, and the string quartet beginning a new piece, and nobody around her knew yet that the thing was already in motion, that the machine was already coming apart at its load-bearing walls. She was 60 feet from the broadcast station when the East Service entrance exploded. Not a bomb, a breaching charge, the kind used for forced entry, tactical, controlled. But in a museum gala, it was the loudest thing that room had ever heard, and the crowd responded to it the way crowds respond to sudden violence. Not in one unified way, but in 100 individual ways simultaneously. some dropping, some running, some freezing in absolute stillness, the string quartet stopping mid-phrase. Then the men came in. 8 of them, as Voss had said. Tactical gear under overcoats, the overcoats going as they entered, weapons visible. Moving in coordinated pairs toward pre-assigned positions, exactly as Voss had described to Taehyun in the Seodaemun safe house. What they did not expect was what was waiting for them. Taehyun's people came from 3 directions: from the North Service Corridor, from the catering staging area, from positions within the crowd that had been occupied since 6 o'clock. They were not law enforcement, and they did not move like law enforcement. They moved like people for whom this kind of room and this kind of engagement was a known quantity, and the collision between the 2 groups happened fast and loud and ugly, the way real violence always was. Not cinematic, not clean. Furniture going over and glass breaking, and the crowd screaming and pushing toward exits that Han's team was managing to keep clear. She kept moving, 50 feet, 40. A mercenary broke from his engagement. She saw it in her peripheral vision. Someone peeling off from the main contact, moving toward the north end, moving toward the broadcast station with the specific intent of someone who has a secondary objective. He was between her and the camera setup, and he was moving faster than she was. She stopped. She looked at the distance, looked at him. Then Yoon came out of nowhere. Later she would think that she should have known. Yoon had been in this building since 6 o'clock. She had mapped it. She had been inside the Foundation's infrastructure for 14 months. She understood the geometry of this space the way Naya understood the geometry of archive rooms. Yoon hit the mercenary from a side angle with the focused efficiency of someone who fights the way she did everything else. Without decoration, without excess, with the absolute minimum required and not 1 unit more. He went down. She stood over him for a second, looked at Nia across the chaos of the room, and made a single gesture. Go. Nia went. The broadcast station was a compact setup. 3 cameras, a technical director, 2 operators who were currently pressed against the back wall, and looking at her with the wide-open expressions of people who had just discovered that their Saturday assignment was not going to be the straightforward event coverage they'd been briefed on. She looked at the technical director. Young, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that handled equipment better than it handled crisis. "I need to go live," she said. He stared at her. "Right now," she said. "All 3 networks. Whatever you're feeding out, I need to interrupt it, and I need to be on camera." She looked at him steadily. "There is a federal anti-corruption operation executing in this room right now. The evidence has been legally submitted, and the warrants are live. What I have to say is a matter of public record. You're not broadcasting classified information. You're broadcasting a woman making a public statement about a criminal network." She paused. "But I need to do it in the next 90 seconds before someone in this room tries to stop me." He looked at the chaos behind her, at the people running, at the plainclothes officers working the perimeter, at whatever was happening near the East Corridor. He turned to his board. "Camera 2, he said to one of the operators. "Get me a clean frame." She stepped in front of camera 2. She looked into the lens. She thought about her father's voice. "Trust what you can prove." She talked for 4 minutes. She said her name. She said Ethan Hargrove's name. She said the Foundation's name. She said the name Voss had given them. The principal above the Hargrove level, the name that had made Han go still at 2 in the morning. She described in plain language what the archive contained, how it had been accessed, and where the documentation now resided in the federal legal record. She said her father's name. She said the names of 2 others, the Netherlands, Canada, who had been set up by the same mechanism. She said that prosecutors in 3 countries had received documentation that morning through coordinated legal channels, that the Foundation's accounts were being frozen in real time, that the men who had just breached the museum's east entrance were contracted mercenaries dispatched to eliminate witnesses to a criminal conspiracy. She said all of it in a voice that was completely steady. She was not steady inside. Inside she was made of something that was burning and cold at the same time. Some combustion of exhaustion and grief, and the particular fury of a person who has been quiet for a very long time and has finally been given the correct room. But her voice was steady and her eyes were on the camera, and she did not look away. When she finished, the technical director was looking at her over the top of his wire-rimmed glasses with an expression she couldn't read. "It's out," he said. "All 3 feeds. Live." She stepped away from the camera. The gunshot came from across the room. Not at her. She understood that later, after, when she could reconstruct the sequence. It came from the East Corridor, where Tae-hyun had been drawing fire away from the civilian concentration toward the service area. She heard it as a single distinct sound above the noise of the room, and then she heard two more in quick succession, and then she was moving toward the sound before she had consciously decided to, pushing through the thinning crowd toward the East Corridor, against the direction of everyone else, because she was the only person in the room moving toward it rather than away. The corridor was narrow and lit with emergency backup lighting, amber and insufficient. She saw Tae-hyun's men first, two of them, managing one of the mercenaries who was disarmed and down. Then she saw Tae-hyun. He was against the wall, hand pressed to his side, below the ribs on the right. His face was doing the thing it always did, controlled, reading, processing. But his jaw was set in the specific way of a person who is managing something physical with everything they have. She crossed the corridor. She put her hand over his. His was pressed hard against the wound, and she added the pressure of hers to it, and felt the warmth of it, the wet of it, and kept her face at the same temperature she'd kept it in front of the camera. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable," he said. "That's not a medical assessment." "No." A beat, his eyes on her face. "I heard the broadcast. It went out." "I know, my people confirmed." He exhaled slowly, carefully. "All three networks." "Yes." He looked at her. She was close enough that she could see the effort in him, the will being applied to the body, the same thing she'd been doing all night in a different register. "Your father," he said. "Han filed the motion 4 days ago," she said. "It's already in review." She paused. "He's coming home." Tae-hyun closed his eyes. Not for long. A few seconds. The way a person closes their eyes when they've been carrying something heavy and have just been told they can set it down. Then he opened them. "The room," he said. "Is it? It's Han's now. Your people managed the mercenaries. Nobody in the civilian crowd was hit." She kept the pressure on his side. "There are paramedics outside. They've been outside since 7. Tae-hyun." "I know," he said. "I know." He looked at her hand over his. "You can let go. I won't fall." "I'm not letting go because I think you'll fall," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his face, not the shadow of a smile this time, not the partial thing, something more complete and more quiet. The expression of a man who has been waiting for something he wasn't sure he deserved, and has just found it standing next to him in a corridor with its hand pressed against his wound. "Nia," he said. "Don't talk," she said. "The paramedics are going to tell you not to talk anyway. Save me the trouble." He didn't say anything else. He let her keep her hand where it was until the paramedics came through the corridor door 40 seconds later. And even then, she stepped back slowly, not quickly, the way you release something you're not done holding. Book. The months after were not clean. Nothing that large ever resolves cleanly. The law is slow and adversarial and produces outcomes that satisfy no one entirely, and the people who work within it, Han Jae-won among them, spend years in the machinery of it, watching the thing they built get tested and challenged and partially dismantled and rebuilt into shapes that were close to what they intended, but not exactly. The Hargrove Foundation was dissolved. Its accounts were seized across 4 jurisdictions. Ethan Hargrove was arrested at the museum on the night of the gala and was in federal detention within 72 hours. The foundation's senior attorneys, the ones who had constructed the documentation used against her father, were indicted. The principal above the Hargrove level, the name Voss had given them, was the subject of an international coordination effort that took 8 months and produced results Han described to her over the phone as significant but incomplete, the specific language of a prosecutor who has learned not to call victory until the last appeal is exhausted. Voss cooperated. He received terms that she did not know the details of and did not ask about, because there were things the law required her to accept that she didn't have to be comfortable with. The mechanism by which those things worked was Han's domain, not hers. James Brooks was released from the federal facility in Georgia on a Tuesday in January, 4 months after the gala. She flew to Atlanta. She stood outside the facility gate in the cold Georgia morning and waited, and then the gate opened and her father walked through it, 61 years old and 4 years older than she remembered, and walking with the particular gait of a man who has spent time somewhere that teaches you to be careful with space. He was thinner. His hair had gone entirely gray. He was wearing the clothes her mother had brought him, and they didn't quite fit. He saw her. He stopped walking. She crossed the distance between them, and he put his arms around her, and she stood in them and did not say anything for a long time, and neither did he. And the Georgia cold was sharp and real, and the ground under her feet was solid and ordinary, and the only sound was the highway in the distance doing what highways do, indifferent, continuous, the world moving in its own direction. "Baby girl," he said finally. "I know," she said. "How?" "I'll tell you everything," she said. "Later. I'll tell you all of it." She stepped back and looked at him. At the gray hair, the careful gait, the 4 years she hadn't been there for. "Right now I just want to take you home." He looked at her for a long moment. The way he'd always looked at her. The specific attention of a father reading his daughter for who she actually was, rather than who he hoped she'd be. She'd never been able to get away with anything under that look. She'd always been grateful for it. "You look different," he said. "I am different." He studied her. Good different or hard different? She thought about it. "Both," she said, at the same time. He nodded. He put his arm around her shoulder. They walked toward the car where her mother was waiting, and her mother got out of the car before they reached it and walked toward them fast, and the three of them stood in the cold Georgia morning in a way that didn't require narration. She opened the studio in March. Yongsan District, 2 floors above a Korean bookshop, south-facing windows that let in the kind of flat white light that conservators lived for. She bought a workbench and a proper climate monitor and spent a week organizing her reference materials, the books and specimen samples and archived photography that she'd been accumulating since graduate school. Some of it she'd lost. The spectrometer, several irreplaceable reference volumes, items from the apartment she'd never gone back to. She replaced what could be replaced. The rest she adapted around, the way you adapt around anything that can't be returned. The studio's first commission came through Hanjae-won, a municipal archive with water-damaged records that needed professional assessment. She took it not because she needed to prove something, but because the work itself was what it had always been. Exact and demanding and entirely hers, the one part of her life that had never been constructed by anyone else. She worked long hours. She had always worked long hours. She didn't think of it as hiding. It wasn't the same thing as the 6 years of being inside someone else's design. She was building something. There was a difference, and she knew what the difference felt like from the inside now. Yoon came by the studio once in April. She arrived without announcement in the way she did everything. Knocked once, came in when Nia called out, and stood in the center of the studio looking at the workbench and the organized shelves and the south-facing windows with the neutral appraisal she brought to every room. "It's good," she said, which from Yoon was significant. "Thank you," Nia said. "How's your head?" Yoon touched the scar above her eyebrow. Faint now, nearly gone. "Fine." She looked around the studio once more. "He's out of the hospital," she said. "Has been, since February." Nia kept her eyes on her work. "I know." "He's restructuring," Yoon said. "Removing the elements that needed removing, moving things toward the legitimate businesses." A pause. "It takes time." "I know." Yoon looked at her. "He doesn't ask about you," she said. "I want you to know that. He doesn't send me here. He doesn't ask me to report." She paused. "He asks about the studio through Han. Who tells him? That's the extent of it." Nia looked up from the work. "I'm not keeping distance," she said. "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm building something and I need to know it's mine before I—" She stopped, found the right word. "Before I share it with anyone." Yoon nodded once. It was a nod that contained comprehension without judgment. "I'll tell him that," she said. "You don't need to tell him anything," Nia said. "He knows." Yoon left. He came in autumn. A Tuesday, late afternoon, the studio full of the horizontal gold light that came through the south windows when the season changed. She heard the knock and said, "Come in," and looked up from a pigment analysis she'd been running for 2 hours, and Tae-hyun came through the door. He was alone. No security behind him in the stairwell. She'd heard only one set of footsteps. He was wearing ordinary clothes, dark jacket, the kind of thing a person wears when they're not wearing a role. He looked like a man who had been through something significant and had come out the other side, changed in ways that were not dramatic but were real. There was less of the controlled stillness in him, or maybe it was still there but sitting differently, less like armoring and more like structure. He looked at the studio, at the workbench, the shelves, the south light. He looked at her. She had a stool at her bench. She got down from it and moved to the small table by the window where she kept a kettle and 2 mugs because she'd started having morning tea there when the light was right and had never stopped. She put the kettle on. He sat in the chair across from her. They were quiet for a moment, not the silence of 2 people who don't know what to say, but the silence of 2 people who have been through a specific sequence of events together and are sitting in the aftermath of them and letting the room hold that before they decide what comes next. "Your father," he said. "Good," she said. "Slower than he wants to be. Better every week." She looked at the kettle. "He's consulting again. Small firm, 2 colleagues who never stopped believing him. He called me last week to tell me about a client meeting." She almost smiled. He sounded like himself. Taehyun was quiet. "Shin's daughter," she said. "Safe. She's been out since October, back in school." He paused. "Shin is cooperating fully with Han's office. He'll testify." Another pause. "It won't undo what he did, but it won't be nothing." "No," she said. "It won't be nothing." The kettle went. She made the tea, black, the same she'd made 100 times at the workbench. Nothing ceremonial about it. She set his mug in front of him and sat with hers, and they were quiet again for a moment. "I made a calculation 14 months ago," he said. "I told you I was wrong about it." "You did. I want to say it again," he said. "Not to ask for anything, just because you deserve to hear it more than once." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong. The calculation was... It made sense inside the operation. It doesn't make sense when I put you across from it. What it cost you, those 14 months. I knew you were inside something designed to use you, and I chose the operation over the warning. And I have not been able to make that sit in a way that doesn't require me to say it to you directly." She held her mug. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's not absolution," he said. "I know that too." She set the mug down. "You were wrong. You've said it twice, and both times you meant it. I can tell when you mean things." She looked at the south window, at the autumn Seoul outside it, the city in its continuous motion. "I've been thinking about the difference between a person who makes a wrong calculation and a person who doesn't examine it. You examined it." She looked back at him. "That's not nothing either." He was looking at her with that reading look, that assessment, the one from the alley, but different now. Not evaluating a variable, something more like recognizing something he'd been waiting to see. "What do you want?" he said. Quiet, direct, no decoration. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not performing consideration but actually going into herself and finding the true answer rather than the easy one. "I want to know you," she said. "Not the operation, not the profile, not the man who managed an investigation and made calculations about my life." She looked at him steadily. "I want to know who you are when you're not doing all of that. If that person exists." Something moved through his face, not the shadow of a smile, the real one. She'd never seen it before. It changed his face entirely, took 10 years off it, made him look for a moment like a person who was allowed to want things. "He exists," he said. "I'm not entirely sure what he looks like yet." "That's all right," she said. "Neither am I. We have time." He picked up his mug. She picked up hers. Outside the south windows, Seoul moved in its ordinary Saturday rhythm, indifferent to the small room above the bookshop, indifferent to the 2 people in it who had come through the same fire from different directions and arrived here. In this autumn light, with their hands around warm mugs and nothing left to manage, and everything still to figure out. The city glittered. The light held. The kettle on the counter ticked as it cooled. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that 2 people build together, the kind that takes time to make and means something specific about who they've become and where they're standing now. Not rescued, not finished, not clean. Just present, just here, just choosing one ordinary Tuesday to begin.